first time Native people and European people met, colonialism is when one power, when one country takes over another country and uses the other country for its own gain. So, for example, like if my country conquered David's country and every year I told David to give me a tax of 50% of his harvest, that would be colonialism.
Like that's harsh.
Yeah, that is harsh. Like Rome. Rome to Israel. Like Romans colonized the Israelites. Colonialism. Colonialism has happened between European countries and First Nations and natives in general. Okay? One update I want to give you guys. Actually, this is important. So we don't use the word Indian, but the word Indian pops up in a lot of legal documentation because it was the original word that we used for First Nations people. But we know that they're not Indian because they're not from India. So don't call First Nations people Indian because that's not the correct terminology. Native has actually, the word native is the same thing as Asian. So if you want to think of native as like, what does native mean? It's kind of the same thing as Asian. So I wouldn't look at Chia and say she's an Asian lady, right? Although I might, if I want to describe a broader thing, but what would I say? She's Korean, right?
Actually.
Yeah, or yeah, and like if you want to get deeper into it, like even First Nations is a little broad. First Nations is more like South Asian, or like it's like it talks about people that are like, yeah, East Asian. It's like, so think about it this way. Native is a broad term. Indian is the wrong term. You don't never use Indian, but native is a really broad term. It includes like Eskimos. It includes First Nation people. It includes like indigenous people from different parts of the world. So native is a very broad term. And then what was the next one that I was talking about? First Nations. Yeah, First Nations is another broad term. So First Nations is talking about Cree, Anishinaabe, Blackfoot, all these different kinds of First Nations. The people that we're going to are Anishinaabe. That's the very specific term. So like Korean would be Anishinaabe. Anishinaabe and Korean. There are many different types of First Nations people. So, and we have to be careful about the way that we call these people, because it gets really annoying if every time I say like Asian people, like we're talking about a specific people here that we're going to, they're Anishinaabe people. Or if you want to if you can't remember Anishinaabe, just say white dog people, like the people of white dog. Okay? Anyways, that's something that's, I think we should note, okay? We're going to go into our seminar now. Is it rolling? It has been rolling, okay. Okay, so we're going to go into our seminar today. It's on a very, very broad topic, very, very important. We're going to go from the very, very beginning. Very, very beginning. So, Jacob actually mentioned this, but first contact between Europeans and First Nations people happened before we started documenting things. So actually, like there are like small tales and small stories about like from these like Norse people, these Viking people, about contact with a strange land and a strange people that lives in that land. And the Norse people actually called these First Nations people, they called them Skraelings, which is a derogatory term actually. Even from the very beginning, the very first Europeans to come in contact from Greenland, so they went south, contacted these First Nations people in Canada, and they called them Skraelings, which I forget what exactly it means, but it's like a derogatory term for, as basically saying like inferior people. the inferior people, the people who are very, very shy and gentle, and like they don't really go out of themselves much. So there was this contact even before we started to really document things. And from the very beginning, it was a kind of contentious thing. People theorized that in the end, the First Nations who lived there attacked the Norse people who started to try to live on the territory, but there was conflict, and in the end, the Norse settlement died out. So they stopped trying to live on, they predict it was Newfoundland. Like they first made it to Newfoundland, which makes sense, and then there's there's archaeological findings that show that their settlement of Norse people died out, and probably because of conflict. After that, though, that was in like the thousands. That was in like the first millennium. But in the 1500s, 1534 to be exact, a man by the name of Jacques Cartier, an explorer from France, made it onto what we kind of know as Canada, right? He came on to Canada, this continent, the North American continent, and he claimed it. He claimed the land for Francis I. So that's the king. That's King of France. This shows a very important mode of thinking. European people, this is how European people thought back then. European people thought that if there is nobody living there that's European, then they can just claim the land for themselves. So Jacques Cartier, when he landed, the first thing he did was he made a huge cross. He made a huge cross and he claimed it for his king. Because it doesn't belong to anyone. It doesn't belong to anyone. At least that's what he's thinking. But it does belong to people. That land was inhabited, and Jacques Cartier knew that First Nations people, Native people, lived on the continent, but he still claimed it anyways. It's like if I went into my friend Attila's house. My friend Attila is a Hungarian person. If I went into my friend Attila's house and I'm like, there's no Koreans here, I'm going to claim this house for myself. Does that make any sense to you? Is Attila there? Attila is there. He's living there. But you don't. And I'm talking to Attila, but it's basically like, I don't see any Koreans around. I'm going to take this house for myself. So weird. Doesn't make much sense to us, but it made a lot of sense to the Europeans, because the Europeans had a very European-centered mindset. Other people were not actually like full-blown people to them. It's hard to explain, but they didn't have ownership over their own land. Jacques Cartier claimed it for his king. However, I will assure you that First Nations people were there a long time before. They had a thriving civilization. They had trade going on. They had systems of governance. Everything was on, like everything, they were doing everything. It's just, they weren't European. That was the problem. So 1534, Jacques Cartier comes and he claims the land for France. And then in the 1600s, a lot of people from Europe start to come. And this is when they start to document, write down, actually the contact that people had with First Nations. And from what we know in those first contact summaries is that generally the French people found the First Nations people very friendly. They were friendly, they helped out a lot because Canada was really, really cold. And French people live in a tropical kind of, like France is very warm. And so when they came over, like, they're gonna die. We don't know how to survive. How did they survive? First Nations people helped them out. They told them, this is what you gotta do. If you catch a cold, this is what you gotta do. When winter is coming, this is how you make clothes that will help you survive. They gave them a lot of knowledge, and also they started to trade. So the first thing, like this is really funny, but in France, like beaver pelt hats became all the rage. Beaver pelt hats. So hats made out of beaver fur was so popular, but the resources were scarce. So when the French people started to live on Canadian soil, they're like, hey, these First Nations people know how to hunt beavers very, very well. And so they made a trade. They would trade weapons and metal tools, and First Nations people would hunt beavers for them and do prepare the skins of the beavers so that French people could take it back to France and then sell it there. So good trade happened between these two parties. And basically, as the French were coming in, they started to take a majority of the control of the land. Majority of the control was in French hands until 1763. So French people were there for a very long time. They had this trade relationship and they controlled the land. They controlled the land until 1763. As this was happening, something very important was happening between First Nations people and French people. And these things were called treaties. Treaties. This is another very important word. So please repeat it after me. Treaties. Treaties. Treaties are agreements. There are contracts. The way that we make contracts now are kind of what the treaties represented back in the time. Okay? And this is very important because first of all, we already mentioned the difference of understanding of land and how to claim land, right? And Europeans having a very European-centric mindset, so they claimed the land for themselves even when Native people were there. Native people, Aboriginal people, First Nations people, whatever, had a very different understanding of land, right? Here is another place of conflict, treaties. For European people, treaties, contracts, were real estate deals. Real estate deals for self-interest. So basically, I'm making a deal with these First Nations people so that I can control this much space and I will give you, in return, this much resources. A lot of the times, this is what the treaties were. First Nations people would say, you can live on this land, you can take this part of the land, you can use it, but you'd have to give us in return this much metal tools, weapons, and other resources every single year or every single month. Right? That's how the Europeans understood it. This is how it worked. This is a contract. This is a real estate deal. First Nation people, on the other hand, it was different. The understanding was different. When people made treaties, it was more of a, you and I are now in a relationship, a trusting relationship, and we're going to share our resources, and we're going to do our best to take care of each other. The difference is, Europeans are thinking about how many kilometers, how many resources, what are you going to give me, what am I going to give you? As long as I give you what I said I would give you, and you give me what you said we were giving you, we are okay, we are squared. There's not much of this relationship idea. There's not much of this trust idea. The First Nation understanding, it's more of a friendship, right? And sometimes when you're friends, it doesn't matter that you didn't give 1 meter of your land. It doesn't matter. Like, you can walk onto it and they can walk onto your land, and you're buddies, you trust each other. That happens all the time. But the European understanding is different. Once you've given me this, if you walk 1 meter into my land without my permission, you're trespassing. And I can take you to court. We can have a legal disagreement. But that's not exactly the way the First Nations people saw it. And so even in this treaty making, people are saying the same words, they're agreeing to the same things, but their understanding is different. What does it mean to have a treaty between two people? Fundamentally different. There's still problems to this day on how people interpret treaties. And actually, there was a case quite recently, quite recently, but in terms of history, it was recent to us, where the Supreme Court decided everything in a treaty we're just going to interpret for the benefit of First Nations people. If it helps First Nations causes, we're going to interpret it the most beneficial way for their interpretation. Because they understood the treaties were made for their benefit as well, but Europeans have been kind of thinking about it another way. Anyways, as these treaties were being formed, however, there was a lot of problems still. A lot of problems. There was disease, interclan conflicts, and of course colonialism, when a lot of these French people were coming in. There was fighting between First Nations on who was going to trade with the French people. So everyone wants to trade with these guys, but even amongst First Nations, there's different people, right? There's Anishinaabe, there's Cree, there's Blackfoot, there's a whole set of different kind of First Nations people, and they start fighting. They start fighting with each other. There's the Iroquois, and they're fighting with each other to see who can trade with the French, and there's death because of that. Also, there's diseases. A lot of Europeans brought a lot of diseases that First Nations people were not prepared for. Their bodies were not prepared for. Like smallpox was a really big problem. Smallpox and a lot of other diseases brought from European people started to kill off a lot of First Nations people. Also, European people started to hunt a lot of the food that First Nations had come to rely upon. So one of them was bison. One of them was bison. I forget which people it was, but like First Nations people know if we hunt this many of this animal, then next year they're going to have trouble coming back. Like if we hunt too many, then it's not going to be good, and we can't plan for the next year. And so they hunted a certain amount to help themselves, but also to ensure that the next generation will also have food to eat. You know, European capitalism doesn't work that way. It's like, look, there's this resource. If we don't hunt them right now, everyone else is going to hunt them, and we're gonna lose out. And so we're just going to hunt as many as we can right now when we have the opportunity. However, when that happens, you get a lot of problems. And a lot of these animals that First Nations people have learned to sustainably hunt, European people just hunted them into extinction. So a lot of famine happened. A lot of First Nations people died because of the overhunting of the colonizing Europeans. Okay, all this to say, before contact, people estimate there were 2 million First Nations within Canada, the territory that we now call Canada, around 2 million people. After contact, into the 1800s, it is estimated that 2 million people shrunk down to 200,000 people. So,
oh my gosh,
there was a lot of death, a lot of death. It's
90%.
Yeah, so she did the math for you there. 90% death rate, like not death rate, 90% like population shrinkage because of this foreign body coming in and a lot of problems happening. Okay? 1763, something big happened. There is something called the 7 Years' War. Well, it didn't happen in 1763, but there was a change in power in 1763. In 1763, the power in Europe switched from the French to the British. There was a huge war called the 7 Years' War, where it was fought on the European continent, it was fought on all the colonies, it was fought everywhere. And it was all European countries fighting against each other. Like, they were all fighting. And in the end, the winners came out to be the British people. The British people beat up the French, and what happened was the French colonies went into British control. Because once I beat somebody in a fight, I can take their stuff if it's war. If I beat up a guy, I'm going to take his wallet in war. And so the British took everything that the French had, which included control over the North American continent. So the British took control of French territories and that's why we speak English today, not French, because the British won. Right? So colonial control switches. British gain power in Europe and all French colonies are given over to them. And the British thought about their relationship with First Nations people differently. The British thought, look, we have this problem. These First Nations people are dying out. A lot of them are dying out. And it seems as though every time we want to expand our territory, they're there. And we have to do these deals with them. Instead of trying to do deals with them, let's just try to make them into British people. Let's just make them into British people. And then there will be no problems because they're going to be on our side and they're just going to help us do what we want to do. And this is when something called assimilation happened. Assimilation. Okay? People thought this would... They weren't trying to do this because they thought... A lot of people were, but a lot of other people thought this would be the best direction for First Nations people. They're dying out, right? You have these huge population decrease, and the British people thought, we're going to help these people out. We're just going to give them the power to thrive in our culture. So we will assimilate them. To assimilate a people means to help these people or to make these people follow your culture instead of their culture, to help them to provide for themselves and flourish in the culture, in the dominant culture. And so they started to assimilate. And you can see by these pictures, right? These pictures over here. First you have the three boys in the First Nations attire, and then they're in European attire. Same thing over here.
Are they the same people?
Yeah, they're the same people. They're exactly the same kids, just in different attire. And these photos were done. These photos were done to show something. They were propaganda to show, look, we turned these three savages into these civilized gents. We took this savage and turned him into this civilized gent. It's there in order to show you assimilation. This is the benefit of assimilation. The Christian European culture is better inherently and will help these people to survive so much better than their savage culture. And so in the 1700s, in the late 1700s, there was this call for assimilation. Now, there was a very specific way that Europeans decided we're going to assimilate First Nations people. There's a very specific plan. And that plan was education. Education. We're going to educate these First Nations people and turn them into Europeans. So that's when you get the residential schools. Okay? So this is the first Prime Minister of Canada, Sir John A. Macdonald. And this is what Sir John A. Macdonald said. When the school is on the reserve, when you have a school on the reserve, the child lives with its parents who are savages. And though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men. Okay, that is the first Prime Minister of Canada, okay? And he is using some very charged language, but the idea is this. The idea is this. If you take children away from their communities, put them into European communities and teach them in European schools, they will become like us Europeans and they're going to do well in life. That's the basic idea, okay? So the slogan, the very, very famous slogan is kill the Indian in the child, or kill the Indian to save the child, right? It's like saying to kill the Korean in Rema to save Rema. Does that make any sense to you? It doesn't really make sense to us, but it made sense to a lot of these people. Yes?
Quote, it says when the school's on the reserve. So at this point, the reserves already exist.
So, yeah, so exactly. So in some treaties you have these ideas of people live on this section of land, right? But the residential schools do not exist at this point.
Right.
And so Sir John A. Macdonald is talking about something, and that understanding of assimilation becomes practiced later on, right? So start them as young as possible. As young as you can find these kids, take them. Take these kids when they're super young, put them in these schools, or else it's going to be too late. When you're too old and you're too set in your ways, they were afraid you can't change the child. And so you got to take them young. Teach them European skills to survive in a European-style society. So they created residential schools. They created residential schools in order to teach them these Christian or European values that would help them to survive. These schools were run by the government, but also the churches. They were run together. Catholic churches ran 60% of the residential schools. Anglican churches ran 25% of the residential schools. United and Presbyterian churches ran 15% of the residential schools. Okay? And they shared the financial burden with the government. These schools ran something called a half-day program, where the students in the morning would study the 4 R's, which don't all start with R. Reading, writing, arithmetic, which is math, and religion. Until 12 o'clock, they would study these 4 things, and then the next half of the day would be working. The boys would do carpentry or do farming, and the girls would do sewing and house chores. And they did that in order to teach these boys and girls how to live properly in the European way, right? The carpentry and the farming done by the boys were actually also used for funds. They made the children work so that they can take the children's work and sell it to fund the schools. So there was a lot of child labor as well. Of course, there's a whole lot of problems. A whole lot of problems with this. I know this is kind of hard to listen to. David, Josh, try to stay awake. David, Josh, try to stay awake, okay? Try to stay awake. David not looking back like it's another David. No, I'm talking to you. Okay? There's a lot of problems. Okay? First of all, the school didn't have a very good, schools didn't have a clear path to reaching their goals. They didn't have clear goals. They had no clue exactly what are we trying to accomplish. We know we're trying to make them into Europeans, but what level of reading, what level of writing, what level of math do they need to know? They don't know. They don't know. And so they don't know how to get there. And they don't know what sources to use. So, first of all, no clear goals in the system. Also, when you take a kid away from their parent, it's going to cause a lot of problems. A lot of problems. We all know that now we know how important a parent is to a child's development. You know how important a child is, how important a parent is to the child's development. Back then, I don't know why, but they didn't understand that this would cause problems. When you don't grow up with your mom or your dad, of course it's going to cause a lot of problems in the kids. There was a lot of problems internally with the children, insecurities, fears that were caused by not having their caregiver right beside them. Because these schools, so the teachers, some of them were not good teachers. because the schools did not have enough funding, the government didn't give enough funding to these schools, right? Why give enough money to these residential schools when you're already struggling to give money to all the European schools? It's hard, and so just don't give them a lot. And so residential schools didn't have a lot of funding, and they didn't have the resources to screen and hire the right teachers. They didn't know who to hire. And so they hired a lot of people that were underqualified, didn't know how to teach, or the people who actually had a lot of deep problems, like sexual predators. That's what I'm talking about. People who were trying to find ways to take advantage of the kids, right? That's when you have things like sexual abuse happening. Sexual abuse was very rampant in the residential schools, where teachers would abuse the children, taking advantage of them. There was also a lot of physically violent teachers who would beat kids for speaking their own language. How would you feel if somebody beat you up for speaking Korean, right? That's basically what was happening, or speaking Chinese. They were trying to take away the language of the kids so that they would learn English to speak properly. And so if they spoke any sort of Ojibwe or any sort of First Nations languages, they would beat them to stop them from speaking it. Any part of a culture, their own culture, it's something called cultural genocide, okay? These abuses led to, obviously, like a lot of pushback. So some of the kids protested by like setting fire to the school or running away. And there was a lot of cases where they tried to run away, but the teachers caught them and then brought them back. Or some kids ran away but didn't know how to go back home, and so they died in the cold outside. By the 1950s, unfortunately this went on for really, really long. So I said the late 1700s. It took them literally like a century and a half, 150 years to figure out this system is not working. This is not working. And so the government is like, okay, we have failed. The residential school system has failed. People knew that this was not working. Let me be clear. People knew, and a lot of people went into these schools and they were documenting like, why are like half the kids dying in these schools? Why is there no joy in these schools? They learned about it and they told the government, but the government didn't do anything about it, right? And so people knew, but 150 years later, they said, okay, officially this is not working out, and so we're going to hand it over to Indian Affairs. Isaac might talk a little bit next week about what Indian Affairs is, but we're going to hand it over to, let's say, the First Nations government side, the First Nations part of the government, and they'll handle it. But then they didn't give enough money to the First Nations part of the government in order to make it right. And so in the end, they're like, let's just shut it all down. And it took all the way until 1986. 1986, no?
1996.
1996, sorry, my sources are incorrect. 1996 for the last residential school to close down. Okay, some of you were alive.
I was alive.
Yeah. Now, we're almost at the end, but there are consequences. And Isaac's going to talk about this a lot. And for the people who have not yet gone onto a reserve or haven't seen White Dog yet, you will see these consequences right before your eyes. Okay? Low self-esteem and the loss of identity due to hopelessness and self-abuse, or leading to hopelessness and self-abuse. Right? If you have been told all your life in a residential school, God hates your culture. God hates your parents. God hates you for being who you are. And so you have to change and become like me. If you've been told that all your life, you're going to have some self-confidence issues. More than that, you're just going to fall apart. You're going to have identity issues. And so that loss of identity leaves you hopeless. Don't know where to go. Don't know who you are. And that leads to self-abuse in a lot of cases. That I think is this statistic if you can see by 100,000 people, right? Males, there's around 24 people, non-Aboriginal or non-First Nations people, who would commit suicide. That is
5 times.
5 times. That's multiplied by 5 times in males. Females, 35 and 5, right? So I think that's a conservative count in my personal opinion from what I've seen. But it shows you there are consequences to what you see. There's also, you might think, well, you know, that happened a long time ago, but there's been a lot of time since then. Like, have these statistics gotten better? Have they gotten better?
When is this?
When is this? Not exactly sure, but this is quite recent.
Okay.
Quite recent. You can check it up on Health Canada. Anyways, the problem with these kind of issues it's a generational issue. If you lived inside of a residential school without your parents, right? Your guardian is this teacher who beats you every day, who sexually abuses you, and you grow up and you become a father or a mother. Who is your role model for fatherhood or motherhood? Who is your role model? You have no role model. And worse, your role model becomes that person who abused you physically and sexually. And so your children grow up with a father or a mother who don't know because they've never seen what good fatherhood or good motherhood is. So your children grow up under this delinquent family. And then when those children grow up and they have kids, what is their role model for good fatherhood or good motherhood? Right? It's a generational issue. Every single generation is affected by this, even if that generation never saw residential schooling. And so there is this false idea out there that, hey, look, your parents went through residential schooling, you didn't. Why don't you just, get up and do better? Not that simple. Not that simple. Not saying hard work doesn't bring benefits, but it's also not that simple. And so you will see some kids in White Dog still suffering from low self-confidence, not feeling like they're good enough. And you wonder why, because they didn't get abused by residential schools, but they went through troubles because of this generational issue. Now, this should affect these ideas, this trauma should change the way that we think about missions, okay? Especially for the youth. I want to talk about you kids. Like you youth missionaries who are going, okay? My mistake when I was a youth kid, and I hope it will never be your mistake, okay? My mistake as a kid was thinking, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to be like Rambo. I'm going to kill all these demons and like people are going to like rise up because of my actions. But that's not the actual missionary way, especially not towards this issue or these people, okay? That's the colonial mindset. That's colonialism. Going in there and trying to take over things in order to change them the way that you think is going to actually help without their input. I'm going to ask you to fix that. If that's your mindset right now, change your mindset. Change that mindset, okay? We are going to be like Jesus. We're going to listen. We're going to laugh. We're going to play. We're going to pray. And we're going to wait. We're going to wait, okay? We're not going in there to fix anything. We're not going in there with our tools to fix a broken pipe. Okay, this issue is bigger than us. This issue is bigger than a 5-day mission trip. It took 500 years of abuse to bring these Native people, these First Nations people to where they're at. It's not gonna be fixed by a team of 35 people going for 5 days to White Dog. Okay? We're going in there to show them a different message, to just present a different message. They have been taught, a lot of First Nations people from residential schools have been taught, God hates your culture, God hates you. We're showing them, no, that's not true. Jesus Christ loves you. Jesus Christ loves your culture. And Jesus Christ accepts you for who you are. We are there to present that in word, through our message, and in our actions, the way that we conduct ourselves. The First Nations people will interpret your actions and will interpret your message the way that they will interpret it. We're not there to interpret it for them. We're there to show Christ as purely as we can, and they will interpret it the way that they interpret it. And if in the future we have youth or adults that reach out to us and ask us to do something for them, or if in the future they ask us to ally with them in some sort of project, then we shall work with them. Then we shall work together towards some goal together. But we are not going in there ourselves to try to fix something by our own hands, right? So make relationships. Make relationships. As simple as that might sound, I want that to be your first and foremost goal. Go in there to be friends. Make relationships. Cry when they cry. Laugh when they laugh with you. And if you learned anything about residential schools, just do the opposite of that. Do the opposite of that, okay? If God wills, He will raise up people. He will raise up people, He will raise up leaders. But we are not God, and we are not going to do that. If God wills, He will do it. And we are there to witness what God is doing, and we're there to celebrate what God is doing, and we're there to mourn if there's mourning, and we're there to show Jesus Christ as purely as we can. Okay? That is what we're going to do. So make friends, play, pray, cry, laugh, and we shall see where God leads this mission in the future as First Nations people hear and interpret and see what Jesus Christ is all about. Okay? Okay, sorry, that was very long. That was very, very long. I know that it's hard to listen to all of that, and it's impossible to fit centuries worth of history into an hour lecture. So I don't expect you to remember all of this. I don't expect you to remember all of it. But please try your best, okay? Is there any questions? Any questions as to anything that I talked about? Everyone get up and stretch around a little bit, and then maybe a question will come to you.
Are you guys going to address the TRC at all? Is that next week?
TRC.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission?